A young pilot climbed into his SE-5A fighter, fastening his leather helmet and adjusting his goggles against the chill. In his small cockpit, he carried a revolver, a flare pistol, flight maps, and a basic survival kit. The bare essentials for a man going to war in the sky. But one thing was missing, something that could mean the difference between life and death. A parachute. This wasn't an accident or a shortage. It was official policy. Every pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, soon to become the Royal Air Force, was ordered to fly without one. Across the front lines, German pilots already had parachutes, small packs strapped to their backs that could save them if their planes caught fire. But British and Commonwealth aviators were denied the same protection. This decision didn't come from engineers or test pilots. It came from high-ranking officers, men who had never faced enemy fire. They believed that giving pilots an escape option would weaken their courage. To them, the parachute represented not safety, but temptation, a way out when things went wrong. Major-General Hugh Trenchard, the commander of the RFC in France, was among the strongest believers in this idea. He argued that if pilots had parachutes, they might abandon their aircraft too early, rather than fight to the end or attempt a forced landing. In his view, a true airman would fight harder if his only way home was to bring his aircraft back in one piece. This philosophy soon became written policy. As early as 1914, parachute makers had approached the War Office with working designs, but the offers were rejected. Officials agreed that balloon observers, who hovered helplessly above the front lines, could use parachutes because they had no way to escape an attack. Their hydrogen-filled balloons were easy targets for incendiary bullets, and when they were hit, jumping was the only option. But airplane pilots, the War Office reasoned, could maneuver away from danger. They didn't need parachutes. At least that's what the higher-ups claimed. Behind this reasoning was something deeper, a cultural mindset that mixed class, honor, and outdated ideas about heroism. Flying in the First World War was still wrapped in romantic notions of chivalry, a kind of gentleman's duel fought in the clouds. Senior officers worried that parachutes would make pilots seem less brave, men who fled instead of fighting. There was also an unspoken class distinction. Balloon observers often came from lower social ranks, while fighter pilots were seen as gentlemen of the air. To some in command, it was simply improper for a gentleman to jump from his aircraft. His honor, they believed, demanded that he go down with it. But those lofty ideas had deadly consequences. The aircraft of 1917, SE-5As, Sopwith Camels and others, were fragile machines made of wood, fabric, and highly flammable lacquer. Fuel tanks sat just in front of the cockpit with almost no armor. Tracer and incendiary bullets could turn these planes into flying torches in seconds. When fuel lines were hit, flames would race through the cockpit, giving pilots only moments before they were engulfed. Aviators called this horrific fate going down in flames. Many carried revolvers, not to fight the enemy, but to take their own lives rather than burn alive. If their aircraft broke apart in mid-air, the fall itself was terrifying. From 15,000 feet, a pilot had almost a full minute to watch the ground rise toward him. Some chose to jump early to avoid the flames, preferring a quick death to the agony of fire. Others stayed with their crippled planes, trapped by G-forces or desperately trying to regain control. The mental strain was overwhelming. Many pilots developed what was then called flyer's heart, or neurasthenia, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Every mission could be their last, and they knew it. The fear wasn't just of death, but of the slow, fiery deaths they had seen their friends suffer. Officially, the War Office claimed that denying parachutes preserved discipline and ensured aircraft wouldn't be abandoned unnecessarily. But beneath that reasoning was something far colder, a calculation that valued machines over men. Each fighter plane cost thousands of pounds to build, the equivalent of about $150,000 today, while a new pilot could be trained in a few weeks. A damaged plane, they reasoned, might be repaired or salvaged. A lost pilot could simply be replaced. Major-General Trenchard's memos made this thinking painfully clear. He argued that if pilots had parachutes, they might bail out of planes that were still flyable, wasting valuable equipment. This logic seemed sound on paper, but it ignored the brutal reality. In most cases, a pilot thinking about jumping was already flying a doomed aircraft. Fires, structural damage, or engine failure meant that saving the plane was almost impossible. The no parachutes policy became more than a rule. It became a symbol of pride. Changing it would mean admitting that the command had been wrong and that hundreds of pilots had died unnecessarily. As time went on, that admission became harder and harder to make. The result was a silent tragedy. Men risked and lost their lives not just to enemy bullets, but to a philosophy that placed bravery and machinery above basic survival. By 1918, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard of fire and canvas. British and Commonwealth pilots still climbed into their fragile machines without parachutes, while across the lines, their German opponents were jumping to safety. The German High Command had begun equipping its pilots with parachutes in 1918, most notably the Heinecke system, a crude but life-saving device. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the cords tangled or the canopy failed to open in time, but it gave German airmen a fighting chance. For many, it meant the difference between a fiery death and another day to fly. British pilots could only watch in disbelief. Reports came back from the front. German aviators bailing out of burning Fokkers and surviving to fly again the next week. It was proof that the technology worked. But inside the Royal Flying Corps, soon to be renamed the Royal Air Force in April 1918, official policy still refused to change. Trenchard and his staff stood firm. To them, the parachute was a coward's tool. They claimed it would encourage pilots to desert their aircraft at the first sign of trouble, rather than fight to the end. Letters began pouring in from the front lines. From squadrons losing men daily to fire and crashes, some pleaded for the chance to carry parachutes, even at their own expense. Others were more desperate, describing the horror of watching fellow pilots trapped in flames, screaming as they fell from the sky. But the War Office ignored them. Official correspondents described these requests as lacking discipline. In one memo, an airboard official even wrote that the sight of an officer abandoning his machine might have an unfortunate effect on morale. The argument was absurd. Morale was already shattered by the constant loss of friends and squadmates. By mid-1918, the average life expectancy of a new British pilot on the Western Front was just 11 days. The policy wasn't inspiring bravery, it was fueling despair. Meanwhile, the Germans continued refining their parachute system. It was standard issue for observation crews and later adopted by fighter squadrons. The Heinecke parachute was far from perfect. It used web straps connected to a spring-loaded canopy that deployed when the pilot jumped clear. But it worked. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe German pilots bailing out at just a few thousand feet and landing safely behind their own lines. Even if they were captured, they were alive. And that survival mattered. Every pilot saved meant one less man lost, one more veteran to train replacements. British intelligence officers noticed. Reports from downed German aircraft, captured documents, and eyewitness testimony all confirmed the same thing. The Germans had solved the problem, but instead of inspiring change, British command doubled down. Trenchard's replacement in 1918, Sir John Salmond, carried the same mindset. He agreed that a parachute would make a pilot less aggressive. Even as the RAF introduced new aircraft like the Sopwith Snipe and Bristol F-2B, no effort was made to issue parachutes. Behind closed doors, however, engineers were already working on one, the Irvin Air Chute, designed by American inventor Leslie Irvin. His tests in early 1918 had proven successful in the United States, and the system was later adopted by American forces. The British were aware of it, but trials were limited and delayed. The war, they argued, would be over soon. So why bother changing policy now? For the pilots still flying daily missions over the Somme, Arras and Cambrai, that reasoning meant little. They faced German fighters equipped with parachutes, while they themselves had none. It was a cruel irony. The side that had once ruled the skies now sent its men to die by its own stubbornness. By the summer of 1918, internal dissent was growing. Some senior officers in the field began quietly challenging the policy. Squadron leaders reported to higher command that morale was dangerously low, not because of fear, but frustration. Men were willing to fight, even die, but not to burn alive because of outdated pride. In one famous incident, a squadron leader allegedly wrote in his diary, "They tell us courage means staying in a burning machine until it hits the ground. I call it madness disguised as duty." Still, the War Office refused to back down. The Air Ministry's official line was that parachutes were unnecessary for the efficient prosecution of air operations. That phrase, cold, bureaucratic and detached, summed up the entire tragedy, even as Allied pilots fought bravely in the closing months of the war, in the massive air battles supporting the 100 Days Offensive. Their commanders refused to budge. Hundreds more died in flames or shattered wreckage during those final months, even as victory drew near. When the armistice finally came on November 11, 1918, it was a moment of relief for those who survived. But for thousands of families who had lost sons and brothers, the knowledge that many deaths could have been prevented was a wound that never healed. After the war, the public began asking questions. Why had Britain refused parachutes when the technology clearly existed? Why were German pilots jumping to safety while British heroes burned? The government tried to defend its decisions, but the answers rang hollow. The no parachute policy, once seen as a matter of honour, now looked like a needless sacrifice of human life. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, but the questions had just begun. Across Britain, families mourned sons who had never come home, brave young pilots who had vanished in flames above France and Flanders. As memorials rose in small towns and cities, people began asking a painful question. Why were our pilots not given parachutes when the enemy had them? The newspapers seized on it. Letters to editors demanded answers. In Parliament, members began raising the issue. Sometimes cautiously, sometimes with fury, reports from captured German airmen had made it clear their parachutes had saved hundreds of lives. So why had Britain, the world's most advanced air power, refused to follow suit? The Air Ministry responded with a familiar line. Parachutes were still experimental and not reliable for general issue. But that excuse quickly collapsed under scrutiny. Engineers and test pilots proved that parachute designs had been reliable since at least 1917. Even the British balloon section had used them successfully during the war, saving dozens of lives. The truth was now impossible to hide. The no parachute policy had been a deliberate choice, rooted not in technology, but in pride and outdated ideas about courage. In early 1919, a quiet storm began brewing within the Royal Air Force itself. Younger officers, many of them veterans of the Western Front, began speaking out. They had seen too many friends die needlessly, and they wanted change. One of the loudest voices was Group Captain C.A.H. Longcroft, a respected officer who had served under Trenchard. Longcroft argued that the Air Force's survival as an institution depended on protecting its pilots. Without a safety system, he warned, public opinion could turn against military aviation entirely. But the old guard resisted fiercely. Sir Hugh Trenchard, now promoted and still deeply influential, continued to insist that parachutes were unnecessary for the fighting spirit of the Air Force. He believed that fear of death was what sharpened a pilot's courage. To him, risk was the essence of air warfare, and a parachute, in his mind, diluted that noble risk, that philosophy, a blend of Victorian stoicism and military arrogance, continued to shape policy well into the 1920s, even as civil aviation expanded and private pilots began using parachutes for stunt flying and air shows. The RAF stayed stubbornly behind. In 1920, internal reports again recommended adopting parachutes after a series of fatal peacetime crashes. Each time, the Air Ministry shelved the discussion. The reasoning was always the same. The additional weight will reduce aircraft performance. The risk of premature use could undermine discipline. Pilots must trust their machines. It was a tragic echo of the war years. The same excuses, recycled to justify inaction. By 1924, public patience began to crack. The RAF had suffered several highly publicised accidents during air displays, including one at Hendon Aerodrome, witnessed by hundreds. A fighter caught fire mid-air. The pilot, trapped inside, had no chance. Newspapers described the horror in graphic detail, and once again demanded reform. Meanwhile, abroad, other nations were moving forward. The United States Army Air Service had adopted the Irvine air chute in 1922, with impressive results. Parachutes were saving lives in peacetime and proving reliable in tests up to 20,000 feet. In France, too, the Service Aéronautique had equipped its pilots with emergency parachutes. Even smaller European air forces were adopting them. Britain, the country that had once led the world in aviation, now looked embarrassingly behind the times. By mid-1925, pressure inside the Air Ministry finally reached a breaking point. Test pilot Flight Lieutenant Everard Calthrop, who had campaigned for parachutes since 1915, published open letters detailing years of official obstruction. He had developed the Guardian Angel parachute, which had been offered to the RFC during the war, and rejected. Calthrop's letters were devastating. They showed that working parachutes had been demonstrated, tested and proven, but ignored. Public outrage followed. The press turned the story into a scandal, accusing the Air Ministry of criminal negligence. Faced with mounting criticism, the government could no longer deflect. In late 1925, the Air Ministry reluctantly authorized limited trials of the Irvine parachute. Tests were successful. Pilots reported that the system was easy to use and didn't interfere with flight performance. Even so, bureaucracy slowed everything down. The RAF did not immediately order full-scale production. Months turned into years as officials argued over cost, design, and whether the system should be standard issue. For the pilots themselves, the weight was unbearable. They continued flying high-performance biplanes at increasing speeds, still without the one device that could save them in an emergency. The tragedy of the Great War's policy, the refusal to protect those who risked everything, was repeating itself in peacetime, and for many, it felt like a betrayal all over again. By 1926, the pressure on the Royal Air Force had become impossible to ignore. Years of denial, excuses, and official pride had finally given way to a simple truth. Parachutes saved lives, and without them, the RAF's own pilots would keep dying needlessly. The Air Ministry could no longer delay. After endless trials, arguments, and red tape, the RAF finally approved the Irvine airshoot for operational use. It was a landmark decision, but it came years too late for the hundreds of men who had perished without a chance to escape. When the first shipments arrived, pilots looked at the canvas packs with mixed feelings. To some, it was a miracle of modern engineering, a symbol of long overdue progress. To others, it was a reminder of the command's past stubbornness and of the lives lost because of it. The Irvine airshoot was simple yet revolutionary. It used a backpack-style design with a ripcord handle, a major improvement over earlier static line systems. When the pilot pulled the cord, a small spring pilot chute deployed, drawing out the main canopy behind it. Tests showed it could open safely in less than 3 seconds, even from just a few hundred feet. At first, the Air Ministry issued parachutes only to certain units, mostly those flying high-risk missions or performing aerobatics. Even then, many older officers remained skeptical. Some insisted the devices would cause accidents if they snagged inside cockpits. Others believed pilots might bail out too easily during mechanical failures, abandoning valuable aircraft. That old mindset, the ghost of Trenchard's philosophy, still haunted the Air Force. But the younger generation thought differently. They had grown up reading about the heroes of the Great War, and they knew how many had died needlessly. To them, a parachute wasn't cowardice, it was common sense. The first real test came sooner than expected. In 1926, during an air display at Hendon, a Bristol Bulldog entered an unrecoverable spin. Spectators gasped as the plane spiraled downward. For the first time in British aviation history, the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Gilbert Ware Merlis Green, jumped clear. His parachute blossomed perfectly, and he landed safely to thunderous applause. That moment changed everything. The press hailed him as a hero, not for dying bravely, but for surviving smartly. The public loved it. Newspapers ran front-page stories calling the parachute the new angel of the air. Inside the RAF, attitudes began to shift. Pilots realized that survival didn't make them cowards. It made them experienced veterans, able to pass on their knowledge instead of dying for pride. Each successful jump silenced more critics. Throughout the late 1920s, the RAF expanded parachute use. By 1928, every frontline squadron was equipped with Irvine chutes. The Irvine Company even offered a unique incentive, a Caterpillar Club. Any pilot who saved his life with an Irvine parachute received a small gold caterpillar pin, symbolizing the silk threads of the parachute itself. It became a badge of honor, worn proudly on mess jackets and flight uniforms. Meanwhile, other nations took notice. The US Army Air Corps had already integrated parachute training into its basic flight program. France, Italy, and Japan followed suit. For once, Britain wasn't leading, it was catching up. Still, resistance lingered. Some senior officers continued to argue that parachutes encouraged defeatism. One even claimed that A true airman should think only of saving his machine. But these voices were fading fast. The younger RAF, forged in peacetime crashes and training accidents, had seen too much death to accept old rhetoric. By the early 1930s, parachutes had become standard issue across nearly all RAF units. They were now part of every pilot's gear, inspected before each flight, and treated with the same respect as an engine or control surface. Yet even as this new culture of safety took hold, a quiet bitterness remained. For many veterans, it was impossible to forget the years of refusal, the stubborn pride that had cost so many friends their lives. One RAF instructor put it bluntly in 1931, "We don't jump because we're cowards. We jump because our fathers weren't given the chance." By then, the numbers spoke for themselves. Dozens of RAF pilots had already survived emergencies using parachutes. Accident reports showed a sharp decline in fatal crashes from which pilots had previously stood no chance. The irony was clear. The very device once dismissed as a threat to discipline had become a symbol of professionalism and modern training. It wasn't heroism that defined the new RAF. It was survival, skill, and the ability to fight another day. And yet, the ghost of the Great War's no parachute policy still lingered, not just in the memories of those who'd lived through it, but in the institutional mindset that had once valued machines over men. By 1933, the Royal Air Force had entered a new era. The fragile biplanes of the Great War were giving way to faster, stronger machines. Sleek monoplanes with metal frames, powerful engines, and enclosed cockpits, and strapped to the back of nearly every pilot now was a parachute. What had once been dismissed as cowardice was now considered standard equipment, as essential as a flight helmet or altimeter. The no parachute policy of 1917 had finally died, buried under the weight of progress and the memories of those who had burned for it. The change wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. The new generation of RAF pilots, raised between the wars, no longer worshipped death as proof of courage. They had seen the graves of their predecessors, row after row of airmen who might have lived had they been given the chance to jump. The Air Ministry, once so resistant, quietly rewrote its manuals. Parachute training became a standard part of flight instruction. Pilots learned how to pack, deploy, and even control their descent, skills that would soon prove invaluable because another war was coming. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again sliding toward catastrophe. As Nazi Germany rose under Hitler, the RAF began rearming and expanding at a frantic pace. And when the Second World War broke out in 1939, thousands of young men took to the skies once again, this time equipped with the very tool their forebears had been denied. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, parachutes saved hundreds of lives. RAF Spitfire and Hurricane pilots often had only seconds to escape their burning planes after fierce dogfights with German Messerschmitts. Many would later say that their parachute, a simple pack of silk and cord, was the only reason they lived to fly again. One veteran recalled, "When your cockpit fills with smoke and the stick locks up, you don't think about courage. You think about pulling that ripcord and thanking the man who finally allowed you to carry it." By then, the RAF had fully embraced what it once rejected. Parachutes were no longer symbols of weakness. They were emblems of professionalism, discipline, and survival. A good pilot wasn't the one who died bravely, but the one who came back to fight again. The Irvine Airchute Company, once ignored, now produced thousands of parachutes a year for Allied air forces. Its Caterpillar Club grew rapidly, with members from all over the world, men and women whose lives had been saved by the device. By the end of World War II, over 10,000 pilots had survived bailouts. Using Irvine parachutes, it was a triumph of reason over pride, but also a haunting reminder of what had come before. Historians, looking back at the First World War, would later call the no parachute policy one of the most tragic examples of misplaced honor in military history. It wasn't technological ignorance that doomed those pilots. It was a culture of rigid thinking, a belief that courage was measured by how you died, not how you lived. The irony, of course, is that the pilots of 1917 were courageous, perhaps more than anyone realized. They climbed into their flimsy, flammable aircraft knowing they had no way out. They fought, bled, and died because they were told it was their duty, and they did it without question. Their sacrifice forced the world to change. Every parachute that opened in the decades that followed was, in a sense, their legacy. By the 1950s, as jet engines replaced propellers and the RAF entered the age of the Meteor and the Sabre, the parachute remained, redesigned, refined, but spiritually the same. It was no longer a coward's escape. It was the airman's last line of defense, the quiet promise that no one would ever again be sent into the sky without a fighting chance to return. Today, every military pilot carries that legacy. Every ejection seat, every parachute pack, every successful bailout owes its existence to the painful lessons learned in the smoke and fire of 1917. And in the end, history judged the truth clearly. Courage was never about refusing to jump. It was about daring to fly, even when the sky itself seemed determined to kill you.